The United States presidential election of 1792 was the second quadrennial presidential election. It was held from Friday, November 2 to Wednesday, December 5, 1792. Incumbent President George Washington was elected to a second term by a unanimous vote in the Electoral College. As in the first presidential election, Washington is considered to have run unopposed. Electoral rules of the time, however, required each presidential elector to cast 2 votes without distinguishing which was for president and which for vice president. The recipient of the most votes would then become president, and the runner-up vice president. Incumbent Vice President John Adams received 77 votes and was also re-elected. This election was the first in which each of the original 13 states appointed electors. It was also the only presidential election that was not held exactly 4 years after the previous election, although part of the previous election was technically held 4 years prior. The second inauguration was on March 4, 1793 at the Senate Chamber Congress Hall in Philadelphia. Candidates. In 1792, the President of the United States was still elected by the original method set in place by the U.S. Constitution, which would remain in place until 1804. Under this system, each presidential elector was to vote for 2 individuals. As today, the person who received the greatest number of votes, and which was also a majority of the Electoral College, became president. The vice presidency, however, was given to the candidate who received the second greatest total of votes. Thus, it is difficult to apply modern-day definitions of presidential candidates to this election. Washington is generally held by historians to have run unopposed. Indeed, the incumbent president enjoyed bipartisan support and received a vote from every elector. The parties were not as united over how to cast their second vote, which would effectively be for vice president, there being no question that Washington would win the top spot. Federalist electors threw their support behind incumbent Vice President John Adams, a hero of the American Revolution. Their Democratic-Republican opponents supported New York Governor George Clinton, who had received a handful of votes in the 1788–89 election. Adams and Clinton were technically candidates for president running against Washington, as the Constitution did not distinguish between the two for electoral purposes. However, as it was generally acknowledged that Washington was the choice of both parties for president, the election quickly became a competition for second place. Principal candidate George Washington, President of the United States from Virginia. Federalist candidate John Adams, Vice President of the United States from Massachusetts. Democratic-Republican candidate George Clinton, Governor of New York. President George Washington. Vice President John Adams. Governor George Clinton of New York. Born out of the anti-federalist faction that had opposed the Constitution in 1788. The Democratic-Republican Party was the main opposition to the agenda of Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton. They had no chance of unseating Washington, but hoped to win the vice presidency by defeating the incumbent, Adams. The Republicans would have preferred to nominate Thomas Jefferson, their ideological leader and Washington's Secretary of State. However, this would have cost them the state of Virginia, as electors were not permitted to vote for 2 candidates from their home state and Washington was also a Virginian. Instead, they settled on Governor George Clinton, though Jefferson would receive the votes of 4 Kentucky electors. Campaign. By 1792, a party division had emerged between Federalists led by Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, who desired a stronger federal government with a leading role in the economy, and the Democratic-Republicans led by Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson and Representative James Madison of Virginia, who favored states' rights and opposed Hamilton's economic program. Madison was at first a Federalist until he opposed the establishment of Hamilton's First Bank of the United States in 1791. He formed the Democratic-Republican Party along with anti-Federalist Thomas Jefferson in 1792. The elections of 1792 were the first ones in the United States to be contested on anything resembling a partisan basis. In most states, the congressional elections were recognized in some sense as a struggle between the Treasury Department and the Republican interest, to use the words of Jefferson's strategist John Beckley. In New York, the race for governor was fought along these lines. The candidates were Chief Justice John Jay, a Hamiltonian, and incumbent George Clinton, who was allied with Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. Although Washington had been considering retiring, both sides encouraged him to remain in office to bridge factional differences. Washington was supported by practically all sides throughout his presidency and gained more popularity with the passage of the Bill of Rights. However, the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists contested the vice presidency, with incumbent John Adams as the Federalist nominee and George Clinton as the Democratic-Republican nominee, with some Democratic-Republican electors voting against their nominee George Clinton, voting instead for Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. Adams easily secured re-election. Results. At the time, there were 15 states in the United States. The 13 original states and the 2 recently admitted states of Vermont and Kentucky. The Electoral College consisted of 132 electors, with each elector having 2 votes. The Electoral College chose Washington unanimously. John Adams was again elected vice president as the runner-up, this time getting the vote of a majority of electors. George Clinton won the votes of only Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, his native New York, and a single elector in Pennsylvania. Thomas Jefferson won the votes of Kentucky, newly separated from Jefferson's home state of Virginia. A single South Carolina elector voted for Aaron Burr. All 5 of these candidates would eventually win election to the offices of president or vice president. Only 2 states, Pennsylvania and Maryland, cast popular votes. Overall, there were 28,579 popular votes cast for presidential electors, a record low turnout for a United States presidential election. Popular vote source: U.S. President National Vote. Our campaigns. Only 6 of the 15 states chose electors by any form of popular vote. About 0.88% of the population voted. The 1790 census counted a total United States population of 3.9 million with 3.2 million free population and 700,000 slaves. Those states that did choose electors by popular vote had widely varying restrictions on suffrage via property requirements. Electoral vote source: Electoral College box scores 1789 to 1996. Official website of the National Archives. Popular vote figures are suspect because only 6 of the 15 states chose electors by any form of popular vote. Pre-12th Amendment electoral vote rules obscure the intentions of the voters, and those states that did choose electors by popular vote often restricted the vote via property requirements. 2 electors from Maryland and 1 elector from Vermont did not cast votes. Electoral College selection. The Constitution, in Article 2, Section 1, provided that the state legislatures should decide the manner in which their electors were chosen. Different state legislatures chose different methods. Bibliography. Berg Anderson, Richard. A Historical Analysis of the Electoral College. The Green Papers. Retrieved March 20, 2005. Elkins, Stanley, McKittrick, Eric. The Age of Federalism. Oxford University Press. A New Nation Votes. American Election Returns, 1787 to 1825. Navigation.